What do I think is the most interesting thing about this garden? I think it's such a good example of how intuitive planting sometimes can surpass formal training. Hey plant fans, Sonia here. I've got a few thoughts to share with you about Wendy Whiteley's secret garden. It's not that much of a secret, it's pretty much on the tourist map.
What do you need to know about the garden? It's in Lavender Bay, which is a suburb of Sydney, Australia. Its origins are of derelict land that it was literally used as a dumping ground by a train company. Wendy Whiteley has a house adjacent to the land and planted this up when channeling her grief when her ex-husband, celebrated painter Brett Whiteley, died. In essence, this is a guerrilla gardening venture that transformed the space into a garden masterpiece.
So where does the charm in the garden lie? Because it is beguiling. It has turkeys walking around the little paths and they're in the trees a little bit. These paths, as I said, they snake around. A real feeling of immersion. The tree canopy is full cover. It's mature now. Most of the garden is in shade because of the tree canopy. If you approach from Lavender Street, it's a very steep staircase actually, which is also very attractive. Just being customised on either side, you know, there's artful graffiti and so on. Already you're starting to get planting on the right hand side. Makes a really nice entranceway to the garden. And then as you reach the bottom of the steps, you come out and there's an enormous Port Jackson fig, Ficus rubiginosa. And it's huge, it's statuesque, it's magnificent, very beautiful. It's got a lot of vines hanging down and it sets the tone for the scale of the garden. You very soon come to pockets of art, sculptures. Sometimes there's artifacts left around like rusted ploughs, rusted scooters that lend a certain air of artiness, and that would be expected, I think, because of the fact Wendy is coming from artist circles. She's obviously going to have a lot of artist friends. Lavender Bay, where the garden is well known for being like an artist area, very bohemian. You know, it was the hive of the art scene in Sydney at that time. So yeah, full tree canopy over a lot of the space. It's pretty much all on this steep bank. Figs, palms, lots of tree ferns, which obviously grow naturally in Australia, and a lot of regular ferns as well. Loads of monstera and really big leaved plants. One of the things I found really impressive was the bird's nest ferns. These are huge. Here in the UK we can buy a bird's nest fern, but ours, it has a spread of about 50 centimetres and a height of about 50 or maximum 1 metre. They're quite a small fern compared to a lot of the other ferns that we can get, but these bird's nest ferns are huge. So you can't help but be impressed. I felt a little bit of a parallel between this garden and Jimmy Blake's garden, Hunting Brook, just outside of Dublin, because they've both got that same steep bank that's all planted up, but because of the large area, then it does feel like it could be natural. So you know, you wander down the path and you feel like you feel like you're in a valley and you feel like it could be natural, but actually you wouldn't quite find something so impressive in nature. It's like what Pete Adolph says, the concept of idealized nature. Jimmy Blake is fascinated by large leaves. Australia's climate lends itself really well to large leaves. You've got huge colocasias there, and the monstera is just massive. And like I say, the bird's nest ferns. Under the shade you've got a lot of the really bright irisine, and that grows quite prolifically along the terraces. When the sun catches on the red of the irisine leaves, it's really quite eye-catching. There are some clearings where there are little breaks in the tree cover, and they have been often utilised for little picnic spots, you know, with little tables in and so on. And there we can find things like salvia, Wollemi pine. I love a Wollemi pine anyway, but somehow it feels just that little bit more special when you come across them in Australia. Birds of paradise. Just to speak a little bit more about the location, obviously the land used to be derelict. It was a dumping ground for the railway. That railway is still active. When you walk right to the bottom of the garden, the trains are running past. When you're high enough up on the bank, sometimes you get a break in the trees and you can see like a fantastic view of Sydney Harbour Bridge. We've got some brugmansia here framing the bridge really nicely. It's obviously a pretty iconic vista. But what's interesting is we're looking at the Sydney Harbour Bridge from this direction, but if you were to travel 6 kilometres across the river, and then you can look back on Sydney Harbour Bridge from the other direction, actually from the Botanical Gardens of Sydney. I think we'd all say they're a household name. It's quite interesting to compare them. So we were talking about intuitive planting, and I think anyone who wandered around Wendy's garden would agree it's all done with a sense of feeling. And that's probably because it's got the grief woven in there. She's got a big connection to the place. It's actually where her house is, even though she doesn't own the land that she's planted. And it feels very personal. And then the botanical gardens are obviously magnificent, and they're a joy to walk around and to see all these different species. And we've got a cacti section that will blow you away, and they've got this huge fernery, really impressive. Hundreds of different species of ferns, but there's something about the way it's set out. It's got this scientific edge to it. You know, they're quite orderly, it's quite formal, everything's sort of spaced out. To wander around the two different gardens is a very different experience, and for my money, I would rather walk around Wendy Whiteley's secret garden. That's where I feel like it's a real triumph that she doesn't have any horticultural. She probably does now, but when she started, she didn't have any horticultural knowledge. And then just across the river, you have probably the biggest hub of horticultural knowledge in Australia. But yet still, I feel like Wendy Whiteley's garden triumphs. So take from that what you will. I think there's a little lesson there in, if you don't have formal training, don't let that put you off. Don't let that knock your confidence. Sometimes if you're untrained and you don't know what the rules are meant to be, you can create something perhaps even more wonderful. To go back to the story element, if you think about John Seaman's new garden, with the knowledge that that has come from the phoenix from the ashes of his old garden, which the council razed to the ground, knowing the history, the context of the garden certainly adds something to the garden. I think that's the case with Wendy Whiteley's garden as well, knowing the fact that the garden was born from grief and she had to fight for the garden really helps with the connection to the garden. When you're there, that you know that there's so much invested in that space. You have to remember, this wasn't Wendy Whiteley's own land, you know, essentially this was a massive guerrilla gardening operation. The future of the garden was secured, and actually since then Wendy's gone on to win quite a lot of awards for merit and so on for the garden, and rightly so. Hope that's been interesting. Hope it's been maybe a bit inspiring, a little bit useful. If you do want to check out Jimmy Blake's Huntingbrook Garden to see if you feel like the two compare quite well, check out that video here. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on the garden. Maybe you visited the garden. If not, is this somewhere that you would now put on your list to visit? What are your own thoughts on botanical gardens versus a more artistic garden? See you in the next video. In the meantime, go forth and plant.